You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program, and thank you for tuning in. I'm your host, Daniel Davis. This year marks 5 years that Beyond 50 has been broadcasting wonderful programs for, that's right, you, the listener out there. Well, we figured also at the same time, why not celebrate another wonderful event, 40 years of something that people around the world have come to love and endure. The book joining us today on the program is the author of the book Street Gang, and Michael Davis is our guest. It's the complete history of Sesame Street. And he's here to talk with us about this wonderful, marvelous bit of magic that started on television to become a way to educate youngsters, preschoolers, but it came to be one of those gangs that was embraced and loved by people around the world. 40 years is a celebrated history, and joining us here on the program, I'd like to welcome Michael Davis to the program. And Michael, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Thank you very much, and I should say that Daniel Davis and Michael Davis, no relation, right?
Maybe not, but we can still be friends, right? That's
all
what
right.
Street Gang was all about, was honoring diversity.
I'm all for that.
Now, you spent many years also as a writer and senior editor of the family and a TV columnist for the TV Guide, and
yes.
So you really have a good background when it comes to television when you came to put this story together.
I hope so. I love writing about television, and for a good long time I had the beat covering children's television for TV Guide, and I really always looked upon it as a great assignment and a privilege to write about programs of worth to help parents make good decisions and grandparents make good decisions about what their kids and grandkids should watch. So it was during that time, earlier this decade, that I had the opportunity to write a piece about the 35th anniversary of Sesame Street for TV Guide. And in the research process, I realized that no one had written sort of the book about the show. And I saw a great opportunity for myself because it's just a topic that appeals to me at so many different levels.
Now, amazingly enough, in the book, you write a rich history just about television and television shows in general to kind of give people a background of, you know, how things were hitting and missing, what was working, what wasn't. But one of the most compelling things, and it reminded me even when I was a child, was how Sesame Street came to be conceived. That originally started as a young man was watching his daughter just sitting there waiting and watching the tuning signal on television. And then,
the test pattern.
The test pattern. And I remember doing the same thing when I was a child. Like, for some reason, you just wanted to get up and sit and look at that for a while. But it was at that moment that he began to wonder, what was that allure of television that would capture the attention of children?
Yes, I did the same thing. I grew up in Rhode Island and used to sit Indian style in front of the television waiting for something called Major Mud to come on the air from Boston, a very wacky local children's show. Lloyd Morissette was the man's name. His daughter was Sarah, and she was sitting there waiting for the cartoons to come on at 7. She'd been sitting there for a half an hour, spellbound by the test pattern, and her dad was an experimental psychologist by training. Began to wonder, what is it about television that has this magnetism for little ones? And at a dinner party shortly thereafter, he told this story about his daughter and sort of asked aloud, what if television could do more than merely entertain? What if television could teach? Do you think that television could teach? And that question hung in the air for a moment, and it really got things started. It was the instigating sentence that got Sesame Street on its way.
Now, it was quite fascinating because you start out the book actually talking about the funeral, if you will, of one of the puppeteers, Jim Henson. And you realize that at that moment that a lot was kind of going on its way as far as the magic. And although he was just one of many of the puppeteers, there was Frank Oz as well, is that you could feel like something was being lost at that time, but that somehow Sesame Street would continue on. It was almost though it came to life with his help, but then it just kind of could keep going on in its own direction.
Well, I'm of course very happy that it did, but I think at that moment in 1990 when Jim Henson died at age 53 from a common strep infection, I think it created a crisis for not only for Sesame Street, but for the Jim Henson Company and a lot of projects that were in the pipeline, and a potential deal to sell the so-called classic Muppets of the Muppet Show and the Muppet movies to the Walt Disney Company. And that's why I started the book there. The prologue takes you to the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, this glorious place on the Upper West Side of New York, for what was one of the more remarkable memorial services ever held in the city, an open memorial that not only drew celebrities, Jim Henson's friends and colleagues, but a huge number of everyday people who were in mourning at the loss of this great entertainer and visionary artist. I think a lot of people felt a tremendous sense of shock and loss at that moment when Jim passed.
Mm-hmm. And and you could just feel that particular light that was leaving the world, just in the same way that you would with Dr. Seuss. It was like there was that beautiful piece of America that was so totally rare, and the gifts that they gave just through their work were pretty much irreplaceable, but yet their work continues to live on, and that's what makes it so marvelous about what they contributed.
Yeah, I beautifully said, by the way. I think that when we encounter greatness, we honor it, and we want to continue to share it with our children and our grandchildren, and that's why parents still read Stuart Little to their kids. It's why we read The Cat in the Hat to our kids. There's something that is timeless about it, and Jim certainly had that about him and about his work. That the Disney folks have been releasing seasons of The Muppet Show on a regular basis, and when you see The Muppet Show, it is as timely today. It's just totally timeless.
Right.
The humor works the same way that it did when the show debuted, and Jim Henson strove for that. He didn't weave in a lot of contemporary references into his work. He made it so that the work could be enjoyed for generations yet to come.
Mm-hmm. You think about things like the Muppets. I remember at first I wasn't so sure if I liked them, and I was approaching high school at the time. And then I found myself watching them thinking, this is just zany. Now, I think what's really fascinating about that, as well as Sesame Street, is that what was happening with Frank Oz and Jim Henson is they were beginning to break the mold of not only puppeteering, because they had to, it was something on television, but they added puppeteering to such a tremendous dimension that as you would watch, you would sometimes forget that these are just puppets.
Well, that's true. And when you are with them in person, when you are in front of a Muppet, you completely lose you lose your sense of time and space, and these characters become very real to us. And I think that happens as a result of great writing and great performance. I think that it's certainly true of Sesame Street, that we know the motivations and the soft spots and of the characters. We know Big Bert and Ernie quite well. We know Big Bird. We know Cookie. We know what motivates him. And that really is. It starts in the writer's room, and it ends on the studio floor as these characters are being performed. And I always liken it to The Simpsons. I feel like I know Bart and Lisa's interior life better than I know the interior lives of actors who play characters on television, because it's written so well and performed so well. So Sesame Street shares that with The Simpsons.
Yeah, I was going to say, now when it comes to Sesame Street, how did they decide to formulate the show in a way that it actually greatly achieved what they had envisioned, as far as being not just a show that's entertaining for young children, but actually all ages, but at the same time being able to be a show that was able to teach at the same time?
Yeah. Well, right from the start, it was the only children's show to have a curriculum, a bona fide curriculum that would take research to develop and then research to test afterwards for its efficacy. So there's that. And right from the start, the producers and writers of Sesame Street had this notion that if the show were to succeed, they not only would need to hook in the kids, but they would try to hook in the parent, the caregiver, the older sibling, the grandparent, the babysitter, to sit down and watch with the child. And their supposition was that the child would learn so much more if that would happen. And that supposition was the subject of long-term research done by Sesame Workshop, and it absolutely proves out that if the parent or grandparent sits with the child, they learn exponentially more than they would if they were just sitting there by themselves. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I know in a lot of homes that's the way it has to be. If mom or dad is busy in the kitchen or whatever, Sesame Street provides a safe zone. In fact, most shows on PBS Kids lineup provides a safe zone for children if parents have to be doing something else. So that's why Sesame Street has invited this incredible litany of guest stars and guest appearances through the years. It's as much for the adults as it is for the kids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much so. And I was thinking, too, that in its time, I believe it was 1967 is when it began, that was a time television was still relatively in a fledgling stage, if you will. And one of the things that was beginning to emerge was the essence of cultural diversity. For many people who may remember the I Love Lucy show, that was the first time there was actually an interracial couple that was producing a show on television. So you began to see a lot of rules changing. So I think what made Sesame Street so unique is that the street looked like a common everyday street you might find in America, with the kind of people living in the neighborhood that you might see living in that neighborhood, honoring the different cultural diversities. And that seemed to be very important to Sesame Street.
I think it was critically important to Sesame Street. And, when I hear from people who grew up in rural America or, Idaho or South Dakota or someplace far removed from New York City where, the show was developed and produced, I hear from them that, well, Gordon was the first African-American man I ever knew, I ever saw. Maria was the first Hispanic woman I ever knew. And, you can't calculate the effect of this, how much good it has done for us across the decades, that the original cast of Sesame Street was diverse at a time when, I don't even know that if the word multicultural was invented yet. They had a multicultural cast.
Much less cultural diversity.
Yes.
Now,
yes.
What's really nice about Sesame Street are the, I guess, array of lessons, for lack of a better word, that it shared. And how was it decided what was to be taught, if you will, and what was entertainment and the like?
Well, they decided that every bit of entertainment had to be educational, and every bit of the educational content had to be entertaining. That was right from the start. And there was a wonderful consulting group of advisors, professors of education, psychologists, psychiatrists, pediatricians, child development specialists, early childhood educators. I mean, they had this incredible blue ribbon group of people advising the show and working with the writers to let the writers know what was age appropriate in terms of what the kids could learn. The writers absorbed this information and, through their talent, were able to come up with segments that, in a very entertaining way, taught important concepts. And if anything, at the start, Sesame Street sort of undershot its goals. Its initial goals were very modest. They just wanted to see if the show could result in children being able to count from 1 to 10 and to recognize the letters of the alphabet. Well, goodness gracious, I mean, within one season, they were counting to 20 forwards and back, and and teaching children sight words and to taking on all kinds of challenges that, as we now know, preschool children were ready to take on. Back in the 60s and into the 50s, we didn't pay a heck of a lot of attention to preschool education. Certainly during the era of the nursery school, it was mostly a place to play and socialize. But as we now know, children are quite ready and quite able to learn a great deal before they enter kindergarten, and Sesame Street played a role in that revolution.
I know that you talk about in your book how children were being able to learn from television, and one of the things that you talk about in the book is the fact that, for instance, them being able to sing commercial jingles, and it was quite amazing sometimes to parents what they were able to pick up from television, so you can see how something like this was that right thing at the right time.
Yes, I mean, Joan Gans Cooney, the co-founder of Children's Television Workshop, famously said, if they can learn beer commercials, why can't they learn something, more pro-social? I think that it was a brilliant concept to try to sell concepts about numbers and letters through what were essentially commercials. They were jingles. They were little melodies that stuck in your head. They're still in my head from not only the early days of Sesame Street, but when my children were young and in the early 1980s, and we watched together. They were so effective. And one of the reasons they were was they had a genius writing music for them, actually several geniuses, and the person who gave Sesame Street its signature sound, Joe Raposo, created a huge pile of great melodies and very smart songs, and was really responsible for giving Sesame Street its beat and its voice.
Mm-hmm. Now, one thing we haven't really talked much about when it comes to Sesame Street is one of the key ingredients that made it work, and that's the puppets themselves. Now,
yes, as
these things were created, and as you would watch and embrace them over the years, now we're looking at 40 years this program has been on television. That's astounding all by itself, but that these puppets would have had to have been pretty much formulated off of true people that perhaps were discovered on the street to maintain the kind of character that they have for this long.
Well, I think what they were was projections of certain types,
right?
Certain archetypes, and Cookie Monster, for instance, he's all about id. He's all about satisfying the immediate need, and we know people like that, right? I mean, goodness gracious. Grover.
It's like Big Bird is that gentle, big giant that we all run into from time to time, and even has the voice that goes with it. So.
Yes, and the inquisitive person, the person who wants to know and understand. Mm-hmm. I love Grover. He's my favorite of the Sesame Muppets, and what I discovered in doing the work on the book, that he's the favorite character of a lot of second-borns, and I think we second-borns see ourselves in him, in that he's indefatigable, he's unsinkable, he tries so hard, and he tries so hard to just get a little attention, and to he's willing to try things, and sometimes the firstborns are a little hesitant and they're quieter, and they don't have a trailblazer in the house to help them, whereas the secondborn definitely has somebody in front of him cutting a swath, so he's a little bit more exuberant sometimes, or she, and so I think Grover is very much a projection of that kind of child.
Mm-hmm. And then you also have the one in the garbage can.
Yes, and Oscar was born actually at a seminar at Harvard. That one of the founding seminars to create the curriculum for Sesame Street. One of the professors said, it would be quite helpful if we had a character on the show who would sort of have a non-destructive deviance. It would be a character who would be a naysayer, who would be, a contrarian, someone who didn't always go with the flow, and it would be an important message to give to children that not everybody gets along and not everybody agrees. And so that's what Oscar was all about, and to to Sesame Street's credit, and because of the brilliance of puppeteer Carol Spinney, who is both Oscar and Big Bird, Oscar has been consistently grouchy and caustic, and I think as a result of that when little kids grow up and they enter the world of work and have to work for a Grouch, they understand why he was there. You know, that the creators of Sesame Street prepared a generation or two of children to work with difficult people.
Well, that was one of the magics, too, about what Sesame Street produced as a children's show, is that it would tackle those really tough social issues. And, you know, much as Gene Roddenberry would do the same thing through Star Trek, you couldn't, like today, it seems, you know, the politically correct thing, if you don't do that, can land you in court with a lawsuit.
Yes.
And they were able to do this because it wasn't that as though you were tackling these issues as related to human, but just as related to points of view.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you're right. I mean, that's another feather in the cap for Sesame Street. You know, over the course of the 40 years, they've accomplished so much in so many ways, and you know, the affective curriculum of Sesame Street, promoting fair play and tolerance and celebration of diversity. Those topics, I think, were every bit as important, and maybe more important than the cognitive goals of the show to get kids thinking about concepts and numbers and shapes and relationships. You know, the show has always had an ambitious agenda, and continues to have that. It is just as serious-minded as it ever was, and the creators of Sesame Street, of modern-day Sesame Street, are as interested in the experimental aspects of the show as ever before. They want each year to kind of wipe the slate clean and ask themselves what they could be doing the next year that would be of most help to preschoolers and their parents. What new information is there in terms of research into child development and education? So as long as that spirit exists at Sesame Workshop, as long as they're willing to reimagine it and recreate it and tinker with it, I think I see no end in sight for Sesame Street. Certainly there's no good reason for it to leave the air, because it just serves so many households so well. And yes, it has competition these days. Yes, the lineup on Nickelodeon and Disney Channel and Discovery Kids is very, very good. And there are many good shows for parents and grandparents to consider. But I believe Sesame Street remains the gold standard in children's television, certainly for preschoolers. Mm-hmm. And they have more resources at their fingertips than anybody else.
Now, it also brings up an interesting point about television shows and the possibility that somebody can come and do sort of a knockoff, if you will, or something that seems like Sesame Street, but very much like the Little Rascals. That
Mm-hmm.
was a bit of magic that no matter how hard people tried, they could just never capture the spirit of a show like the Little Rascals. And Sesame Street had that very same touch. So what makes that so unique that somebody just can't come along and say, well, I can do something that's close to that, that no, you can't. You just can never capture the spirit of something like that?
Well, I think the shorthand answer is people like John Stone, the late John Stone, who is now viewed as legendary executive producer of Sesame Street. John and his colleagues had a spirit about themselves. They had a mission that everyone pledged allegiance to, and it's that devotion to cause and that willingness to be silly and to make sure that the show was funny, that I think begins to explain why no one was really able to ever copy Sesame Street. I think it's because of the unique collection of individuals that were brought together first by Joan Gans Cooney and then later by the people she hired, that they created an ethos. They created a culture that has pretty much remained unbroken through the decades, and that to me it's all about relationships, and I think it was the relationships that existed among those creative people that made Sesame Street so unique and so hard to copy.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know that in your book you were talking about how Disney eventually bought the rights to Jim Henson's Muppets and the Muppet Show, but the lady was standing fast and saying, you're not going to get a hold of this one. And what was the problem that maybe she foresaw about Disney taking over the rights of Sesame Street?
Well, Disney was a direct competitor in the world of licensing and merchandising. And licensing and merchandising of the Sesame Street characters since the early 1970s has provided the revenue to keep the show on the air and for Sesame Workshop to spread co-productions of Sesame Street to, they've circumnavigated the world. So Disney, had they been able to purchase the trademark to Sesame Street Muppets, could very easily have crushed them if they'd wanted to and promoted their own products, their own branded products for out there in the marketplace for goods intended for preschoolers and their parents. So, I mean, a lot of it had to do with business concerns. Right. And but also, I think there was a feeling at Sesame Workshop that Disney was not dedicated to the mission of Children's Television Workshop, which became Sesame Workshop. That they're an entirely a commercial venture, and that they're all about they're all about perpetuating characters, but for what goal? And Sesame Street and its matriarchs and patriarchs had a very different idea in mind for what these characters could do. And it wasn't a for-profit enterprise. It was a non-profit corporation that had a for-profit wing that created the money to keep Sesame Street alive. So two very, very different business models, and I don't think they would have been copacetic under any circumstance. So they fought it tooth and nail and persevered, and those among your listeners who will read the book will understand how it happened and why it turned out that 15 years after he passed, somehow from heaven, Jim Henson got exactly what he wanted. Mm-hmm. I make the point throughout the book that he was as willful and as canny a media mogul as you could ever find in Hollywood or anywhere else. It was just Jim's methods were entirely different from Samuel Goldwyn or Jack Warner. His methods were all about passive resistance and silence. He would just sit there in a room and let you talk until you were blue in the face, and he'd say nothing back to you. He wouldn't disclose anything of how he was really feeling, and the only word that he ever shared with people in those instances was, You can almost hear Kermit saying it, right? So it was part of Jim Henson's brilliance. He was a great businessman as well as a great performer.
Now, as we had talked about Sesame Street, which is in a neighborhood that can look like anywhere in America for the most part, could also be a place where you see a lot of culture, different races and yes. People. Would you think that might have been one of them catalysts, without even being aware of it, of how we've come to have an African-American president?
Oh, I believe it. I believe that Sesame Street helped to usher in the era of Obama. Without question, I think for that slice of the population that basically aged 25 to 40, they got their first glimpse of a neighborhood of tolerance and acceptance by watching Sesame Street. They got their first glimpse of a strong African American father and father figure in Gordon, and a great sense of how people can get along and get things accomplished with their words rather than their fists or their actions. And I don't think we could really calculate how important Sesame Street was to the children who watched it, and sort of it helps to explain where everybody's head is at these days in terms of race and tolerance.
Mm-hmm. Well, you can certainly see, too, how Sesame Street has actually landed political figures such as Stephanopoulos.
Yes.
Sort of a joke on the puppet.
Yes, and I would pay money to see Snuffleupagus and Stephanopoulos in the same show.
Well, it's a really engaging book. It's rich in detail, especially as you go through the first few chapters and you're realizing how they're coming up with children's shows such as Captain Kangaroo and how he turned over and he was the clown, and then there was Howdy Doody, but and then something like this comes on the scene. It's almost as though children's television jumped into warp speed and said, well, you guys go ahead and do what you're doing, but we've got bigger stars to go to. And then from then on, it just never stopped or looked back. So
well said. Yes.
I'm kind of curious, how many languages and countries now in the world is Sesame Street airing?
It's 140 countries, but I don't remember how many languages. It's astonishing, though, when you see the list. I can't cite the number, but it airs on every continent but Antarctica, and it's seen in so many hot spots around the world that the Sesame Workshop has made it its mission to have shows in such places as Northern Ireland and Bosnia, and places where children have lived in strife, and they want to make a difference in the next generation of children growing up in those areas. And the way that they believe they can do it is through creating these co-productions of Sesame Street in all corners of the earth.
Now, I think one of the fun, cutest stories when it comes to Sesame Street that I remember is, this was probably about 10 years ago, is I came to work with a Hispanic, and he said that the way that he learned English literally was by watching Sesame Street.
Oh, yes.
And I thought to myself, that's amazing. That there's that tool out there, and then there's an adult learning English from Sesame Street.
That story is repeated over and over and over with first-generation Americans and immigrants who came here, and even adults, illiterate adults who taught themselves to read by first watching Sesame Street. It's a part of the story of the series that would not immediately come to mind for most people. Most people wouldn't know that millions of Japanese school children learned English by watching Sesame Street, for instance.
Wow.
It was an incredibly popular, it still is, show in Japan. So the offshoots of what the show has accomplished are just manifold and staggeringly interesting. At least that's the way it seems to me, because I had a very hard time stopping my research. And
well, I could see just by the detail that you put into it, like how much more is he going to have that's unrelated seemingly to Sesame Street, but you're really piecing a big whole piece of a giant puzzle, actually.
Yeah, yes, thank you for saying so. That's what I attempted to do. I tried to make sure that everything in the book had a reason and a purpose. When you're reading it, sometimes you say, hey, why is this guy taking me down the rabbit hole? But you come out of the rabbit hole and you go, oh, now I see.
Mm-hmm.
So
very much, very much. Well, it's definitely, for those, if you're fans of Sesame Street and you want to know the inside to where you get into a conversation about Sesame Street with anybody, you're going to be armed with things that really will surprise most people. And, it was very much like when I read the biography of Dr. Seuss, and somehow it seemed like you kind of run into conversations where Dr. Seuss would come up. And I remember one of the questions is, did he actually do the artistry and the writing, or both? And I said, believe it or not, he did both. He made books come alive. And you take a look at Sesame Street, what were some of at least one or two really interesting things that, as you were doing your research, you thought, I didn't expect this to come out?
I think that right at the top of that list is the fact that Sesame Street is sort of the nexus of pop culture, that so many people who went on to do other things in show business and in life got their start on Sesame Street, or had played a role in Sesame Street. And I don't want to spoil anything for anybody by reading the book, but one of the themes of the book is how paths crossed in the lives of people who were responsible for Sesame Street in extraordinary ways, whether it was on the set of the Jimmy Dean Show or the Robert Q. Lewis Show. If your listeners will remember that talk show in the early days of CBS television, the fact that one of the founding producers was on Howdy Doody as a production assistant, and that all three of the founding producers worked for Captain Kangaroo. These incredible seeming coincidences that all add up to something greater. And I wanted the reader to, when they put down the book, to wonder, was this all just happenstance, and was it, as Joan Gans Cooney says, dumb luck? Or was something greater at work here? Was there a greater force that drew all of these people together and had them brush shoulders with one another through life to come together to make this show? And I leave it to the reader to conclude for himself or herself what that answer might be.
Well, there's no doubt that after 40 years of Sesame Street being aired on television, that it's been able to compete timelessly throughout those 40 years with television and television shows that tend to promote either sex or a lot of violence, and this tends to just completely promote, education, playfulness, and imagination. So it just goes to show, if something like that can survive this long, what else could we do to hopefully change the scape of what people view and take in. And, hopefully, there'll be something else out there on the horizon, but I guess we're just all very happy that Sesame Street's been able to just thrive for as long as it has.
Amen.
Very much. Well,
yes.
Michael, we'd like to thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today. It's just a pleasure when you get to bring out these little gems that, even though you may not pay attention to it every day, you realize Sesame Street, my goodness, boy, does that just take you right back.
Yeah. I hope that some of your listeners will visit me at streetgangbook.com. I've made what I think is an entertaining and helpful website to augment and supplement the book, and I hope that they visit that website and drop me a note. There's a very easy way to navigate through the site to let me know your story about Sesame Street, and I'm going to be playing back those stories at the website for everyone to share. So I hope you come visit me.
Well, that's great. Well, again, Street Gang is the book, The Complete History of Sesame Street, and our guest, Michael Davis. Thank you for joining us on the Beyond 50 radio program today.
Many, many thanks.
You bet. Thank you. I'll tell you, Sesame Street, great stuff. It's a very detailed book, but I'll tell you, just like he says, it's just, you kind of wonder coming away from it, what kind of forces were together that created such a marvelous show that is now endured 40 years. We want to thank you for joining us. You've been listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. Also visit us at our website at beyond50radio.com. That's the number 50 with a 50, and sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter. Again, thank you for tuning in. You've been listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis, and remember, live your day past halfway.